look at a new thing here because we're going to stop reviewing the other unit we were on. AP has put on the College Board website that that unit will no longer be tested this year, so that's fantastic. What will be tested, however, is Unit 3, the one I skipped. So it's neat. So what we're going to do is get a quick introduction today. I'm going to be assigning a thing on Google Classroom that you must go do. So you got to get that done. I cannot score it right now. However, I'm just going to tell you right now, whenever we get to scoring, this will be an assignment. And then you will have time at that point, but you might as well get it done now. It's vitally important. Anyhow, we're talking about civil liberties and civil rights today. And we're going to look at the background between civil liberties. And then we're going to start looking at civil liberties in general, talking about the 14th Amendment and how that was used to expand civil liberties. I would recommend taking some notes on this, by the way. Civil liberties, simple definition, it's freedoms that protect against arbitrary and abusive government. So if you want to say the government's not doing a good job, well, we have freedom of speech in this country. That is a civil liberty. They can't just crack down on that. Although, there's a news story I'm also going to share on Google Classroom that should concern some of you. So some examples of that. We talked about the right to freedom of speech, your religion, guns. Think the Bill of Rights. That's typically where we see our civil liberties. Civil rights are different. We'll talk about those in a different video. They protect against discrimination from government bodies, or from people. I'm recording a lesson, Amy. Say hi to the students. Say hi.
Hi.
Recording in their house is fun. Civil liberties are difficult. They are difficult to define and difficult to say what's right and what's wrong. So take freedom of speech, for instance. Hold on. Emmy, come here. Come here. Now I've got a crying daughter to give me a bear. I'm sorry. Thank you for the bear. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so in terms of freedoms, freedom of speech is not absolute. You can't say bomb on a plane, fire in a theater. You'll be punished for that. You can't, for instance, without consequence, cuss out a teacher. You can't slander somebody. You can't threaten somebody without consequence. So our freedoms are not absolute. The right to bear arms. Okay, you can own a gun. Can you own a fully automatic 50 caliber machine gun? No, you can't. So we got to balance the interest of your freedoms with the interest in the government, which typically means keeping citizens safe. It's that kind of social contract that John Locke talked about. So an example of this would be snake handlers in churches in the South. This was a thing for a while. These are going to be some strange pictures, but we'll go through some of those examples in a second. But these guys used to carry around snakes, poisonous snakes, in their church, and they would offer the snake to bite different people in the church. Now, what they would say is, if God was on your side, he wouldn't bite you. Or if it did bite you and God was on your side, he would heal you from the venom. Oh, boy. This is how I feel right now, locked in my house with 4 kids, by the way. But with this, the government had to look at that. These people have a right to their religion. They have a right to do what they're doing in terms of in their church. However, people were getting bitten. People were dying. So eventually this was banned as well. So that shows you a limitation on freedom of religion. Now, one of the other examples I had down here was the Amish. If you've been to Arthur, you've seen them with the horse and buggies. They are required to follow some of the traffic rights. So you notice the slow sign here, the reflectors, the turn signals. While their religion eschews the idea of technology, for the safety of them and the public, they are required to wear these. What was happening is people were going down the buggies. They didn't see them in the dark or the morning, and they were hitting these buggies. People were dying. So they required them to do this. Now, I also had an example for the counterfeit thing. They are not forced to send their kids to school. I have a friend that teaches in Arthur, and I said something about teaching Amish kids, and he said, oh, none of them come to school. They are all homeschooled. So even though we require all kids to go to school, they are not required to go to school, nor are they required to meet the requirements of homeschooling because their religion has a different viewpoint on that. So those are some examples. What you must do with civil liberties is draw the line somewhere. What is allowed, what isn't allowed. Those things, they matter. So I got some examples here. Dog sniffing does not constitute an illegal search. It should say "and." I like to see my things here on the recording. But dog sniffing does not constitute an illegal search. If they bring a dog around your car, the question was, is that dog searching your car? Well, in some ways, yes, it's smelling something that is in your car. However, the courts have determined that that scent is outside, so it is not an illegal search. Yelling fire, as I mentioned before, not protected language. We have to know where the lines are. And unfortunately, those lines keep shifting. What's allowed one year because of a court case may not be allowed the next year. So now we're going to shift a little bit, now that we've talked about what civil liberties are, protections against an arbitrary government, protections against, your rights. So we're going to talk about the background to them, kind of the history behind them. So if you remember from first semester, which seems like 10 years ago now, the Bill of Rights was not originally included in the text of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists demanded it as a way to ratify the Constitution. So they're going to add that in, which is what I just said. In 1792, they put 124 amendments to the Constitutional Convention. They finally narrowed that down to 10, which, thank God, because the Constitution test would be a lot harder. So the Bill of Rights originally, and this is important to know, and I would star and circle this case, interpreted to mean that the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government, which this is odd, but what that means is unless a state had a protection in their state constitution, the state could make a law that restricted your civil liberties. The federal government could not. So make sure we understand that. Originally, the interpretation of the Bill of Rights is that it only applied to the national or federal government, not to the states. Many states did add a Bill of Rights. Sometimes those rights were the same, sometimes they were different. But that was held up in Barron v. Baltimore in 1833. The Supreme Court said it only applies to federal government laws. Even with that, the Bill of Rights were only used once before 1866 for a major court case. And that case was one from U.S. history that we talked about, the Dred Scott case. This was the slave that sued his master because his master brought him to Illinois. He said, you can't do that. I can't be denied my property without due process. I can't set him free. So they did uphold the idea that a slave is a slave no matter where you go. Okay, so for most of our history to the Civil War, not really used. After the Civil War is when we see those big amendments. The 13th Amendment. Anybody remember what it is? Rejected slavery, or banned slavery. The 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and then the 15th, which gave voting rights. So the 14th Amendment is the most important, and that's what we want to talk about today. It has a couple different clauses or like parts that we need to know, and I don't know what's going on with my spacing here. I'm sorry about that. So the Due Process Clause is the first one. Star and circle this. You must know this. I guarantee a question on the test on this. The 14th Amendment in general. So the Due Process Clause, it forbids states from denying life, liberty, or property, which should sound familiar, without due process of the law, meaning what that means is they have to go through the steps and the correct steps. You cannot be denied those things. And it relates to slavery. The Privileges and Immunity Clause. No state can make or enforce any law that abridges the privileges, which is the P there, or the immunities of citizens of the U.S. So if I have a privilege from being a U.S. Citizen, a state cannot deny that. Well, the Bill of Rights are privileges. So a state can no longer deny you those privileges. So the 13th Amendment, for instance, can't ban slavery on a federal level, and then Alabama can say we allow slavery. The 14th Amendment makes that illegal. Cannot happen anymore. And then there's the Equal Protection Clause. Star this, circle this. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. No state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. What does that mean for African Americans following the Civil War? Things should have been equal. Well, they weren't. So what does the 14th Amendment not mean anything? If you don't remember, the court case Plessy v. Ferguson set up that it had to be separate but equal. And that had to do with the 14th Amendment. Now, that is not what I wanted. So we're going to speed through this. This should have all been cut. There we go. Okay, so using the 14th Amendment, and again, I would star and circle this. You have to know this term, and it bothers me that I'm not there to teach it to you. But selective incorporation, it's the process through which civil liberties in the Bill of Rights are given and applied to the states on a case-by-case basis. So just because they passed the 14th Amendment didn't mean that every state just shook their heads and said, oh, sure, we're good now. These things had to be challenged throughout American history. So we're going to see court cases here, and a lot of them. And that's where a lot of this test will focus. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, we know that one of the questions is going to be on one of our Supreme Court cases on civil liberties. They've told us that. It's going to be there. So we're going to have to know those cases. So this idea of selective incorporation is established by a court case called Gitlow v. New York. After that, you're going to see selective incorporation in waves. In the 1930s, we see a wave of First Amendment cases. In the 1960s, we see defendant rights, like the right to an attorney. That comes out of the 1960s, and due process rights as well. In the 1970s and on, it's a little more broad. So what has not been selectively incorporated into the states? The Third Amendment, which, if you don't remember, is the quartering of troops. There is no reason for that to have been incorporated into the states because we've never had a problem with that. The Seventh Amendment, and then some other things which we don't really need to worry about right now. So there are your rights not incorporated. So we're going to stop here for today, but on the next lesson, we're going to go through the amendments and talk about each thing. Like the First Amendment, we're going to talk about what the amendment says, and then we're going to talk about what's allowed and what's not allowed, and the court cases that kind of drew those lines, so to speak. The assignment that you have is going to be on those court cases, so you're going to start filling some things in on that. And I'm only going to have the court cases on the assignment that are required by the class. Okay. Thank you for tuning in. I'm sorry this video is a little